Welcome. This is Mr. Williams, and this is Digital Photography, Discovering Your Creative Potential. Today is March 18th, 2026. This is lesson number 9. How is everyone doing? Post-break, everybody's healthy, I assume. I'm back healthy. A couple of different things to talk about. First of all, any submissions that you might have, get them in when you can. Be reasonable about it. You don't have to do more than, say, 3 a week if you're behind or need to get caught up because of the inconsistency of the schedule. Starting next week, we should be back on order. So you have to do your submissions timely or you'll probably get penalized for it. So don't worry about that right now. Just get your work in when you need it, when you can do it. And if you have any questions, email me and any of my either on Genius or Canvas email or my direct email address through the school, and I'll be happy to respond and I'll answer any questions for that. Okay. And so don't worry about your submissions. I'll be reasonable about that, and I'm not trying to penalize anybody, and make sure that everybody gets their work submitted. Okay, so just ask if you have any questions. Let me know, and I'll be happy to help. All right. So today we're going to talk about how do you make a photograph? How do you do it? So when I was in college, okay, I got to work in the photography department of my school, and I started in high school as one of the photographers for the newspaper and the yearbook, and we had a couple of cameras, and we'd use those, and the students would use those, and it was a part of like a journalistic experience that you could write and you could take photographs, and I was interested in photography, and so I started doing that. But in college, we actually had a dark room, and it looked like one of these pictures. And this was a black and white dark room because color was really complicated. It was really difficult. And it took different types of equipment and different chemicals and so forth. So what you did is you had a piece of plastic called celluloid, and then that was rolled into a roll, and what was then commonly called a roll of film. And then a roll of film, I have film cameras. I could show you one, some of my old film cameras, but I could show you what a roll of film looked like. And you took that roll of film and then you developed the film, the celluloid, and it was in a strip, and it was called 35 millimeter photography, which is basically 35 millimeters is about 2 inches, let's say, a couple of inches. And each little picture then that you would take, the light would come in and the chemicals would absorb what was seen through the lens on the film. And it would expose for a fraction of a second. Typically, it could be 100th of a second or 500th of a second or whatever. There's a very precision devices, cameras, and it's according to the light and how dark you wanted it and so forth, and what your f-stop was and all the things that we deal with in digital photography. And that created an image on the celluloid or the film. So then you had to develop the film, okay? Because if you exposed it to light, then it ruined your image because the whole image then would be white, and you didn't want that. And so it was a dark image that created light through the exposure, opening the lens, the viewfinder in the camera, and most of those were what we call single lens reflex cameras, where you actually view through a mirror, then that mirror pops up and it exposes the film, then it pops back down, and that's the modern DSLR, or what we call a digital SLR was prefaced by a single lens reflex, and also a rangefinder camera. A rangefinder camera was where you look through a viewfinder, and then your lens is over to the side, and it would open for a fraction of a second according to your settings on the camera, and that would expose the film. Well, you had to develop the film, and then when you had the film developed, then you took that developed film and you viewed it, and what you wanted to make pictures of, you had a device that was basically it was a modified camera, so to speak, and then that would take a picture of that negative, it was called, and expose it on a large piece of paper, and in the darkroom setting, in the dark where you only had a certain type of light, like a black light or a red light, and it was very dark, and you kind of had to fumble around, but you could see, but just barely, and the room had to be completely devoid of any light coming in, so no windows, and normally it was an interior part of a building. Our dark room was in the upper floor of our administration building, like on the third floor, and it was in an interior room, and I got to run the dark room my senior year, so I developed a lot of pictures, and it was all black and white because color was complicated. And so what we did then was you developed the film. Then once the film was developed, it was hung to dry because you used chemicals to develop it. And then when it was dried out, you could make a contact sheet, and which was like a picture of your developed film. So you'd have an entire sheet, like 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 14, and it would have all your little pictures on it of your negatives. And you would take the best ones and you'd make them into full-size pictures, whatever you wanted for a full-size picture, 5 by 7, 8 by 10, 3 by 4, 11 by 14, or even bigger, like the Ansel Adams pictures. We talked about him incessantly. And here's a picture of his famous dark room. It was very simple, famous dark room, and it's exemplary of a lot of what we're talking about. So you had to develop it twice. And so you took the negatives, and then you developed those negatives and you printed a picture, and then the picture had to be developed, the actual presented product, the photograph, the celluloid developer, and then created the paper picture, which is a certain type of picture or a certain type of paper that was used for that. So anyway, we've beaten Ansel Adams to death, but his was a very famous darkroom where he did a lot of large format work, and he had a specialized enlarger that used it. Basically, was a camera that he had made. It was on racks that slid overhead, and that's how he developed some of those pictures. And a lot of the work that he did, not only was the skill in creating the photograph in the field, because he did a lot of naturalist type work out in the field, not all, but primarily. And so there was that part of it, but also in developing photos that made it look, his signature style. It's called F22, where every part of the picture is developed or developed and in focus. And you don't see that a lot, especially with our smaller cameras today, that the edges of the pictures don't tend to have the same level of focus as the center does. Well, Ansel Adams did. And so anyway, that's how that worked. Okay. So that was Ansel Adams. All right. So black and white film photography, you had a darkened room, and ours normally you made it into a black room, and nothing that would reflect light was left in there, because that would ruin a picture. So the walls were usually painted like a flat black, and then the doorway had had rubber moldings around it where the light couldn't come in, and then you would turn a light on that said dark room in use, and there would be a light on the outside like a red light. So if somebody walked in the room, they would ruin your pictures, and so they would have to knock on the door and wait till you were finished in order to come into the dark room. And that was kind of how we did it. I think that was standard around other places. So, and then chemical storage, and you can see for Ansel Adams pictures, you can see all the chemical storage over here. And these are actually chemicals, and some of these are noxious and harmful type chemicals that include, I don't remember what they all were, but there's an acid stop, the developer that we called a stop chemical. That some of these were kind of funky chemicals that weren't really safe to breathe and so forth. And so we weren't all that concerned with it now, but I think there are more in the modern era. But we had all these chemicals, and then you'd have chemical trays, so little flat trays where you pour your chemicals in there, and then you would set your film in it or your finished picture and watch it develop. Literally, it would develop in front of your eyes. And when it got to the point where you wanted it to be, you'd move it into a different chemical called a stop bath, and it would stop the exposure at that level. Okay. So the developer was a chemical that literally took the image and it slowly, it was a blur, a little bright, a light image, and it made it into a darker image. And remember, this is black and white. So when you got to where you wanted it to be, then you stop that by putting it in a different chemical called the stop developer. And then those were hung to dry. Everything, we had tongs and had rubber gloves and all that, and to keep the chemicals off you. And then we would hang those on like a wire, or it looked like a little clothesline with little clips on them, looked like paper clips. You'd hang those to dry, and when they were dried, when the negatives were dried, then you could use those to go into your enlarger, which was like a camera-like device that made the print. And the print was like a piece of paper that had a picture on it, and that's what we created. So that's called a print in the photographic world. And contact prints were all of our negatives put together that you could view those and use that for creating a larger print. Okay, and so that's how that went along. Well, color came along in 1972. Famous company you've heard of called Kodak was the largest American company, and they made cameras, and they were really known for their film. And they had famous film, like Kodachrome was an f/64 film that was that the f-stop, or the speed of the film was 64. It was called the ASA, or what we call the ISO now, but the speed was the ASA. And I can't remember what ASA stands for. You have to look it up. But that was the speed of the film. And Kodachrome, that was their perfect color film, but it was pretty slow. And then their fast black and white film was called Tri-X-Pan. And that's what we used, because it had an ASA of 400, and it was easier to take pictures in low light settings like sporting events and stuff like that. And so they were very famous at Ektachrome, Kodachrome, Tri-X-Pan. They're a very famous film company. And they basically lost their mojo when the digital world came along. Now they do a few things, but they filed bankruptcy a few years ago. And so Kodak, it was in Rochester, New York, was their headquarters. It was a very famous company. They came up with what's called C41 processing. C41 was a 3-step color processing. Color processing was very complicated before that. And it involved knowing what all the primary colors were and getting pictures to develop. In early color pictures, when you look at them, you'll see that some of the colors are really developed and some of them are kind of bland. And it doesn't really look that good because of the processing elements that it took, the complications to develop a color picture. And so C41 came along, and it had three basic colors. I think they were like blue, red, and green, but don't quote me on that. They had 3 basic colors. I've never done it because it was too complicated. That evolved then to a machine where you could literally put a roll of film into a machine, and the machine would, in the darkness of the machine, would unroll the film, would develop that, and then would print pictures for you and give you your negatives back and your pictures. And you could do that in a drugstore. That was an evolution of Kodak C41 processing, and it was very revolutionary. And it created good color pictures, much better, than the original color pictures. And so the next phase then is digital to developing, which is what we do. And so what we do is we have a digital image that bypasses the whole negative thing. And it's far superior as far as convenience and time and frankly, the quality of the image. Although there are people that still love and use the old film system. There are photographers that use that, but that's here or there, and that's another discussion. So our processing then crops, edits, manipulates the image, and we do this digitally on a computer, just like you guys are working with now. Ensures the original is not destroyed, so you have an original that's set aside, and you can use that if you ever want to go back and change your editing or re-edit and do it a different way. allows the storage and future usage of images. So it's a far superior system in terms of convenience and time. And now a photographer can, I can shoot an event and shoot 1,000 frames. If it's a sporting event where I'm doing multiple frames per second, like 8 or 10 frames a second, you can shoot a couple thousand frames in a few minutes, like a basketball event, where there's constant movement and so forth. And trying to find that perfect picture. Well, you couldn't do that when you're developing film because you couldn't see the image until it was developed. It's usually that day or the next day or whenever. And like if you're working for a newspaper and you shot film, you had to drive that film back to the facility, the newspaper facility, to the headquarters, or overnight it if you're out of town, let's say, and then or have an independent lab process it for you, and then you could see your pictures and then decide which ones to use and so forth. Okay, and then so in the digital world, then once our image is processed, then we have a printer, which can be a little home printer, is black and white or color, whatever your circumstance is. It can be a little printer, or it can be like a cheap desktop unit, to a professional model, which can be small in size, or it can be large in size, which will do murals or very large pictures, and those tend to be many thousands of dollars. And so your high school probably has one of those printers on your campus, one of the large digital printers that will develop like poster size pictures and print those for you. So, and the size then depends on usage requirements and budget and so forth. So C41 was developed by Kodak in 1972, and the company was called Eastman Kodak. And there was a guy named Kodak, I think, back in the day, and they had started the company. Strangely enough, they didn't have very good cameras. The Germans and Japanese had the best cameras. The reason is because their lens technology was developed in the wartime years, World War I and World War II. And Americans developed radar on their ships, the rangefinders of their ships primarily used radar, where the Germans and the Japanese used ground glass. And so those ships would shoot, say, 15 or 20 miles or whatever, and you would have to see the object you were shooting at, and they used very large ground glass items that was the envy of the world. That technology transferred into Nikon and Canon and the other Japanese companies, and into Leica on the German side. Those were the companies that made the best cameras. And Kodak's cameras were inferior to those, usually like little box cameras or little portable, cheap family cameras, but that they had great film. And so their C41 process was developed in 1972. Also along came CN16 by Fuji, which was the premier 35 millimeter Japanese company. And then Konica and Agfa were the European countries, the German companies. CNK4 by Konica and AP70 by Agfa these were the German conglomerates, and that's what they called themselves. And they developed color processing, which modernized it. And so the great color pictures we have today generated from that process. And so it's a standardized system for color development. So you could take anybody's film and run it through your machine, and it would create the best pictures. And then each of these films was known for a certain quality of like a standout color. Agfa was known for really standout color, and Konica was known for something else, and then Kodak then was known for whatever type of film it was. And again, that Kodachrome, and there's a song, Paul Simon wrote a song, you may or may not be familiar with it, called Kodachrome. And it was considered probably the best film for 35 millimeter. And that was an American film. As the system progressed, the machine could automate it. It was pretty cool in that regard. This is a picture of an enlarger that I took off of a website of a company selling them. So basically, it's a camera on a stand, and you rotate it north and south or up and down, and that generates the size of your picture. So imagine in a dark room that you're printing a picture, and you have your negative, and you use this to You use this, and the picture is displayed, and then you have a dark cabinet where you pull out your print and you set it on the board on the bottom, and you position it exactly how you want it, and then it's time for so many seconds, and when that's done, it turns off, and then you take that print and put it in the developer, and then you put it in the stop bath, and then you hang it, and you have a print. And this is a modern, it's called a Besler condenser enlarger that's used today, and this is a brand new device that's sold right now for people that want to use that. And so I took that from a photographic website, and this device is $2,000. So it's like in the middle of the range. It's not their best, but it's not their cheapest. Okay. All right. So now let's watch a video on analog photography, details, grain, and creative freedom.
Tradition in our family that every second year we spend the Christmas together with my wife's relatives. Typically, my wife's sister reserves us a farmhouse or a mansion where everybody would fit in, and then everybody flies from all over the world.
Oops. All right. Let me see what I did. All right, hold on a second.
Hey, listen, we tried to cover a lot of details today. In my previous video, I explained my main process of creating photographs. And my main process uses negatives only as a face product. I try to get really flat, low contrast negatives, and then make the final decision on what kind of photograph I want, only in the darkroom. And if I have a low contrast, well exposed negative, when I go to the darkroom, I can create from the same negative very different kind of final photographs. So to me, my darkroom, or if I'm doing it digitally, my Lightroom is as important as the photo shoot for creating the photograph. And I'm not interested in trying to get it right already in the camera. As the actual shooting, storing the image on the negative, developing the film, those are only steps towards the final photograph that I create in my Lightroom or in my darkroom.
Watch what nuts do to our body. A walnut is really good for you. It's loaded with omega-3 fats or with fiber, but right next to it.
I guess the same would apply also if you use digital workflow. Like, how do you think about the file that you get out of your camera? and what's the role of the post-processing. But the things that I want to go through today are mostly film related, film process related, and they are sort of controversial in the light of my main process. They sort of a little bit fight against it, and I think it's important to understand that this is not so black and white that I can delay all my decisions to the very end, to my dark room or light room, but I need to make some decisions beforehand. So let's go. First, I need to select the film that I use, and as I explained earlier, I want to use the slowest possible film that I can use in the given situation with as little grain as possible. That guarantees me most details on the negative. It's not the final image, but most details. Now, sometimes I can't do that. Sometimes there's not enough light. Sometimes the situation that I'm trying to photograph is so fast that I need faster shutter speeds, and I need to find faster film. Whenever I go to a faster film, I start to lose some details and nuances and add grain. So my desire to have a lot of details on the film and then at the same time use fast film in the situation that require fast films are sort of fighting. I need to make compromises and I need to choose. And when I choose the film, that is the decision I can't change anymore afterwards. Also, if I use a slower film and I push it, which I sometimes do for various reasons, then I get more grain and less details. On the other hand, if I take a faster film and pull it, go to the other direction, then I start to add details and nuances to my film. So this whole speed situation is something that I need to decide already before I put the film into my camera. And it has consequences that follow me all the way to the darkroom. Let me show you some examples of pushed and pulled film and fast and slow film. And I try to show you examples where you can see how those differences go all the way to the darkroom.
Watch what nuts do to our body. A walnut is really good for you, loaded with omega-3.
Now then, of course, film selection is not only about the speed, also the size of the film matters. If I'm using 35 millimeter, I get much less details than if I use a large format film. And the grain is going to be more amplified in a smaller film size. Now, my process is constantly evolving, and this is how I do things today. However, I'm more and more interested in grain structures, and I like grainy pictures. That may be one reason why I recently started to shoot also with 35 millimeter film, even though just about 2 years ago, I made a video about not shooting 35 millimeter. So, I mean, these are not universal truths. This is a process that keeps on changing. And right now, I like grain, and the grain is one of those things that I can't easily remove or add afterwards. So that decision is done when I choose the speed of film, whether I push it or pull it, and then the size of the negative. Now, then in addition to film, of course, the developer affects the final image. And once again, the grain is one of the main ingredients. I use two main developers in my main process. One is Rodinal, and then the other one is Xtol. Adox XT3, typically, which is an Xtol copy. Rodinal, I like it a lot. It's very flexible. It gives me reliably good results, but it adds grain. and sometimes too much. So I need to make that decision already before I go to the darkroom. That's a decision I made when I developed the film. Actually, I decide the developer already when I choose the film. And then the other extreme, I use Xtol, which is much smoother and gives me more details. But the shelf life is really short, and if I really love grain, then Rodinal is the way to go. Also, Rodinal is very good at stand development. That allows me to manage exposure of my film after I've taken the picture, and gives me a lot of flexibility, especially when I use crappy cameras that really don't allow me to control the exposure. I made some videos about this. I put some links to the description page. Now, some of those videos are really old and not that good, but maybe they give you information, like, for example, about stand development. So, summary of this film section of this video. I mean, film, I need to decide what film I use and how I use it already before I go to the darkroom. And the biggest current challenge for me is, or consideration is, do I love grain more than I love details? Do I love strong lines more than I love nuances? And I need to make that decision already before I go to the darkroom, and I'd like to preserve as much option as I can until the darkroom. But
Okay, guys, we're out of time and run over a little bit in time. So I'm going to stop the video and stop the stop my video as well. I think that's very interesting, listening to a professional that still uses film and why they use film and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, we'll continue on in this discussion later. Contact me if you have any questions. Thank you for your cooperation and patience. And I will talk to you guys next week and throughout the week. If you do have any questions or issues, let me know. Otherwise, take care and I'll see you next week.